Hello and welcome to my Christmas Winter Wonderland set. I'm going to walk you through step by step on how to make these beautiful cookies. Okay, so we're going to start with our stocking cookie. So I'm going to touch down my outline consistency here, and every time there's a little bit of a turn or a corner, I get really close to my cookie, or I touch down if it's a little bit of a corner. If it's a smooth corner, I try not to touch down if I can. Sometimes your icing's not going the right way, so you can touch down, that's okay. It doesn't have to be perfect. And once I let my outline dry for a few minutes, I'm going to come back and flood. And I'm trying to get my flood right up against that outline. If I can cover it a little bit, that's what I'm going for. You can always use your scribe to pull that icing on top of your outline to hide it a tiny bit if it bothers you. And what we're going to do is once I'm done with this top here, flood, I'm going to let it dry and crust over really well, because what we're going to do now is once it's dry enough that I can touch it, we're going to go ahead and put some flood icing on it, and gently I'm going to dab my icing around. So this is my flood because it's easier to kind of dab and spread around the cookie. Now, if your flood is getting, as you're dabbing it and it's kind of just melting away and it's not giving you too much texture, just keep going at it. And if you're still not getting enough, let it sit for, 30-40 seconds and come back with your brush. Once it starts to dry up a little bit, it'll give you more texture. And this is kind of that fuzzy looking top of the sock that we're looking for. You want to make sure that your base is really well and dry enough that you can do this step without poking the icing through. If your icing is just crusted over but wet underneath and you're going a little bit too hard with the brush, you might poke right through your icing. So this step, you want to maybe do this first, this step of the cookie, do all the other decorating you need to do, and then come back to this cookie later. Once you're happy with how it looks, you can go on to the boot part. So here I'm going to start my outline, and I had a little bit of icing on my tip there that just wasn't, I don't like to have it too much hanging out. It won't secure to the cookie, so I just wiped it off on my cookie. I'll hide it with my flood, no big deal. Usually I'll wipe it off with my paper towel, but the cookie works as well. So anytime I have a big curve, I'm trying to not touch down just to get a nice smooth line. Again, if you have to in the middle of the curve, it's not a big deal, but the goal is to get those smooth, nice, round edges. Anytime I have a sharp corner, I can touch down to change direction. It's much easier, but when you don't, whenever you have a nice long curve, then you try to go the whole way without touching down. And then we're going to go in and flood. And again, I'm trying to get it right up over that outline. And if you can't, it's okay. With the first set of cookies, it's kind of hard to get all these little details. But as you get better and better, those are the kind of things that make your cookies look a little bit more professional and sort of, put together, is the details like covering your outline, getting your outline all the way to the edge. But if you're a beginner and this is your first set of cookies, or you've only done it a few times, it doesn't have to be like that. Focus on getting your consistency right. Those are the most important things in the beginning. The rest will come naturally. Okay, now we're going to add a little detail to the stocking here, and I'm just going to keep my bag in one spot and put pressure on to get a ball there of icing and pull down. So I'm going to put pressure in one spot and pull down as I lighten up the pressure. Pressure, pull down, pressure, pull down. And like that, we've got our little holly leaves. And I'm going to take my outline red consistency and make 3 little dots. And the green was outline consistency as well. And we're going to set this aside for a little while for the green to cast over. And now once it's ready, I'm just going to add a little bit of detail here. So I'm going to add 3 dots and just do it throughout the bottom of the stocking. I'm trying to space them out as evenly as possible. Not always so even, but we go with it. And there you go. You have your cute little stocking. I love it. It looks amazing for Christmas. And it's a pretty simple one to do. Okay, next up we have our door cookie. So here I'm going to touch down. I'm focusing on the next corner, and I'm going to touch down on the next corner. That's my goal, is to touch down, lift up my piping bag, and I'm focusing on the next corner, not where my icing necessarily is landing, but where I'm going to get to, because that's where I want to touch down. That will give me the straightest line. Always look a little bit ahead of where you're piping and focus on where you want to touch down again. If it's easier for you to turn the cookie every time you do a line, you can go ahead and do that. Here my icing line broke. So either you can continue piping the line if you want, or sometimes I like to just scrape it off and start from the beginning again. That gives me a nice clean line. Sometimes when your line breaks right in the middle, it's hard to continue a straight line. And because I want this to be nice and straight because it's a door, then I'm going to go in and just, retry that line again. Okay, once I'm happy with my outline, I'm going to go ahead and flood. So I always start my flood a little bit in from the outline. And the reason being is if your flood is really loose or the hole in your bag is a little bit too big and this is your first cookie you're flooding, even if it's not my first cookie, I tend to do this, then I get a feel for how much flood is actually coming out. Sometimes when you flip your bag over to go and flood, and by the time you get to the cookie, a little bit of icing is already starting to come out of the bag. So then when you go to put a little bit of pressure on it and start flooding, it ends up being a lot more icing than you want in that one spot. And if you're right up close to the outline, you may end up flooding right over the outline and over the side of the cookie. So I like to start a little bit inwards and then see how my pressure is, and then go ahead and start closer to my outline. If my flood is a little bit on the looser side, I don't worry about flooding exactly, perfectly and not leaving any gaps. And the looser my flood, actually the more gaps I leave, because if it's really runny, I don't want to overfill that area. It tends to seep over the side of the cookie if it's too runny. So that's why sometimes I have gaps there. But it all fills in with the scribe. Okay, so once my flood base is dry, we want it pretty dry at this stage. I'm using a bigger tip I have. You can use anything round that's nice, small and round that you can use. And I'm going to scrape around the tip here just to make an indent or a mark of where I want the wreath to be. It'll just be a rough guideline so I know when I'm piping my wreath that I'm staying in the middle of the cookie and that I know where to go and make it centered. You won't see the lines I've scraped in the video, and you won't see them after either when I pipe over top of them, but it's just a rough guideline for myself because I can't free pipe a circle very well. And so here I'm going to do some of the details of the doors. So for nice straight lines, again, I want to focus on where I touch down and start to where I'm ending, especially these small short lines. And I touch down and I go straight across and I'm focusing when I want to end. And because I'm doing that, I'm going to get a nice straight line. If I'm worried too much about what's going on in the middle, then I might come out with a wiggly line because I'm focusing too much. So just point A to point B. And it's almost like pulling a string. If you hold the string at one end and you pull it at the other end, the string will naturally straighten itself. So that's what I'm doing with this string of icing. Touching down and kind of pulling it straight to the second point. I'm taking my time, whichever way it's easier. If you want to do, the squares one way, the top ones I did top and bottom first. Now the bottom ones I'm going to do a different way. Just whatever you feel comfortable. If you need to turn your cookie, every time that you do a different line, if you're comfortable piping left to right all the time, go ahead and turn your cookie to make sure that you're always piping that way. Always do whatever makes you feel more comfortable piping, whatever makes it easier for you. It doesn't have to be exactly the way that I do it. And every time you want a nice sharp corner, you do want to touch your piping bag down, and that'll give you the nice corner. And so now I'm going to go a little bit inward from each box and do a second small box. And again, I'm focusing on where I need to go. Because these are smaller areas, I don't want to lift my piping bag up too much. I'm staying really close to the cookie, especially on the top and bottom lines. It's a very short distance, so if you lift up your bag too far, by the time you touch your bag down, your piping line might be too long. So you want to stay really close so that when you're lowering bag to touch down again at the end of the line, you'll know exactly where your icing will stop. And once we finish this detail, we want to let it dry because we will be piping our wreath on top of the top squares. So we want to make sure that it's dry enough that when we're piping our wreath, it's not going to move around or break the icing. So here I have my outline green consistency. So it's a thicker consistency. And the reason I want thick is I want it to keep the shape that I'm piping. And I have two different greens. I have a lighter green and a darker green. I'll link all the colors below in the video. And here I'm just doing 2 sets of greenery. So the first one was some pressure piping, putting pressure, dragging the bag. And now this one I'm just drawing small lines. They don't have to be perfect. They don't have to be, perfectly symmetrical. Just keep layering them on. I usually do 1 layer and then I'll pipe on top. And because it's thick icing, we can do this all kind of at the same time. We don't have to let 1 layer dry because it dries pretty quick and it won't get messed up too much if we're piping on top. So I'm going to alternate between the 2 colors. And here I'm just putting pressure in one spot and then dragging my bag down, putting pressure and then letting go of the pressure and dragging it down. And that's how I'm getting those leaves. And I'm trying to follow as best I can that circle that I scraped in. It's hard to see in the video, but it's going to be my guide. So I'm going to try to stay on that as much as possible. And again, going in with the thicker icing, you can either do V's or you can do lines on one side and then lines on the other side. Here, sometimes it's hard when you're doing a V to keep with a line. So first I want to get all my lines in there, so I'm following that circle. And notice I've turned my cookie for these type, especially like the pressure piping ones, the lighter green. It's really hard to do at a different angle. So for me, I find it easier if I turn the cookie as I go. And again, I'm just layering the lines up. Takes a little bit of time, so I'm putting just enough pressure to get the icing out of the bag. If you squeeze really hard and you have a small hole, this is a pretty small hole in my bag, so if I squeeze super hard, it's gonna just come out and be wiggly, like the line will not come out straight. So what I want to do is just put a tiny pressure, secure that icing on the cookie, and then get that line in there, touch down, and break it off. Same thing with pressure piping. I'm putting pressure and then moving the bag. And as you get the rhythm of it, you can kind of go in a V. And you can always practice this on a paper towel. You don't have to go give this your first try on your cookie. I usually have a paper towel with me, especially when I'm doing greenery and stuff like this. I'll test out my bag a few times, make sure I feel comfortable with it. I'll make sure the hole is big enough or not too big. If you're putting pressure and your hole's really big and you're getting this massive amount of icing coming out, then it's probably best to just get a new bag, cut a smaller hole. That way you have control of how much icing is coming out. You can see here I'm doing V's now with the dark icing. I don't know, I change it up sometimes, whatever's kind of comfortable, whatever works. Sometimes you try different things out and see, if it's working, if it's not working. I like these things. They take a little bit of time for the detail, but they come together so nicely and they don't have to be perfect. My lines aren't perfect. Like sometimes my lines don't even stick to the cookie there. I just wipe it off and keep going. But as you layer them on and you add a tiny little detail here and there, it just looks so good. And that's what I love about it. You don't have to be perfect. You don't have to get it just right. It just seems to come together at the end. And, these cookies, I never thought that I would be able to make these, fancy kind of in style cookies, but they're quite simple when you break it down like this. And every time I don't like something or it doesn't look right to me, I just keep layering stuff on and it just comes together somehow. So here, I just it looks a little empty, like it didn't connect right. So again, I'm just going to layer on top a little bit. It didn't sit right with me that it didn't fill in the wreath. The darker green was so much more thicker and nicer. So just going to go over it and pipe, and you can add some in the middle, down the line, you can add a little bit more there. It really, like I said, if you are not happy with it, just keep layering and kind of adding a little bit of detail here and there, and it sort of comes together. You do it until you're happy. If it doesn't take you that many layers, that's awesome. If, you just, something's not right, just keep giving it a few lines here and there, add a little bit of depth, and it really takes that cookie to the next level and brings it all together. Okay, so now that I've layered up a little bit more on my wreath here and I feel confident that it looks pretty good, I have one more section just to thicken up here so it blends in with the rest of the wreath. And I'm just sort of piping on top of the other greenery, just going in there. It doesn't, if you inspected this really closely, it probably doesn't look that clean. But I guarantee you nobody's going to be looking that close at your cookies. They'll probably look at them, be wowed, and then taste them and be really happy with them. So the finishing touch is going to be our holly or little berries here. And so I've got my red outline consistency. And I like to do little groups of 3s. And I'm just randomly placing them here, wherever I think they're going to look good. I think it really brings out the wreath and makes it look Christmassy. You can add, a few stragglers if you want to, or just leave it as is. Okay, so now we're just going to finish it off with the doorknob here. So I'm just going to do an upside down raindrop here with my black outline consistency. Small area, just use my outline. We can smooth out pretty simply, pretty easily, because it's such a small area. And then I'm going to go ahead and just add another dot so I keep my icing kind of in the same spot here. Make it a little bit of a wider dot and just smooth out whatever I need with my scribe. And there we have our door cookie. Okay, now on to our snowflake cookie. So this cookie has a lot of sharp edges and curves, and I really like the shape. So I want to make sure that I have nice crisp lines so that the shape stays as much as possible. So every time that there is a sharp point or turn, like a sharp turn, sharp point, I want to touch my bag down. Every time there is a small curve, I try to make that whole curve without touching the bag down to the cookie. So here I'm trying to stay as close as I can to the cookie. That way I have lots of control over where exactly my piping line is going. If I lift my bag too high, it's too small of an area and I'm not going to get a nice smooth line, and I'm probably going to have way too long of a line. So I'm keeping it really close, and I make sure to touch down on all those points. That way the icing gets stuck on that cookie at those points and makes it nice and sharp. If you have to touch down on a curve, it's okay. You can continue it on, but it's always good to try not to. That gives you a nice smooth outline. And this is why I like to dry my outlines for a couple of minutes before I go and flood, especially on, designs like this where I really, really love the shape and I want to keep those nice pointy corners and those curves. And if I don't dry my outline, I feel like the flood pushes that outline away, or, it sucks it in a bit, or it just distorts the outline of the cookie and it doesn't give you that nice clean edge. And so after you dry your outline, you go in with your flood, and these little points at the very tip of the snowflake are small. And so you notice that I'm not pushing a lot on my bag. I'm not squeezing it very hard. And notice there's not a lot of icing coming out when I'm doing my outline. I just want to get a little bit of icing going there and get it all to the points. I'm not squishing really hard. Those points are small. If I squish too hard on my bag, I'm going to get way too much icing coming out. And then as I go towards the middle, I can squeeze my bag a little bit harder. More icing's coming out and I can go a little bit quicker. But it's all about controlling the icing because you want to make sure that you don't flood over the side of the edge or, over your outline to keep that nice shape. And then I go in with my scribe, and sometimes I'll pull the icing all the way to the edges to cover my outline. Little corners like this are really hard to get your icing right over your outline sometimes, so that's where the scribe is good to come in and just pull that icing to cover it. And it's not necessary to do this step, but as you get on in your cooking decorating and you want to take your cookies up to the next level, these are those fine little details that, you will probably only notice, maybe not everybody else that eats your cookies will, but it really just cleans them up that much nicer. And so now I'm going to do the details of the snowflake. So my icing is crusted over and I'm just going to draw lines across the snowflake. So I've got my first line here and always focus from point A to point B. So I touch down, I lift it up, and I'm focusing a little ahead of my line and where I want to touch down and end my line. And now the tricky part, the third line here, I'm going to try to cross over exactly where the other two cross in the middle. So I focus on that middle point at first and then at the end, just to make sure I got nice clean lines. And here we're using the same technique as we did with the leaves. So I'm putting a little bit of pressure in the same spot and then dragging my piping bag down. And again, putting pressure down and then dragging my piping down as I let go of the pressure. So that gives me a kind of leafy look or, a little design detail that it's a little bit thicker on the edge. And then as I pull the icing down and let go of the pressure, it gives me a thinner line. And it's a great technique to know because, you do details like this on a snowflake, or you do a little bit of leaves or greenery or any kind of design. It's very versatile. You can pipe the edge of a cookie like this around and make like a beaded edge. So it's a really, really good technique to practice. You can always do it a few times on the paper towel if you squeeze your bag and as you kind of let go, drag your bag down, and then you get the feel for it and how much pressure you need to put, how much pressure you need to let go. And that way, once you get to your cookie, you feel like you have a handle on the bag. And here I'm going to add a few lines in the middle. And you try your best. I'm not always the best at freehanding my designs. Sometimes they go a little bit better than other times. Sometimes they're not perfect. You can see this one's a little bit off. But once the whole cookie is done, nobody's going to sit there and notice like, oh, that line's a little bit shorter or taller than the other ones. So you keep adding details. Don't fret over the small things. And you can do whatever design you want. I'm just kind of going with it and doing a little design here and then adding where I think maybe we need a little bit more detail. So here I'm just going to add a few V's on the lines. I feel like it's a little bare, so it needs a little extra detail there. And I love this cookie cutter. It's so try that again. And I love this cookie cutter. It's such a nice shape and you really don't have to do anything too crazy. And you just do a few lines and a few details and you can do a whole set of different types of snowflakes and using different, piping techniques or different lines, dots, whatever it may be. And they come out so beautiful. And I'm going to finish it off with a few dots around just to add a few more details here. And just like that, you have a beautiful snowflake cookie. Okay, so for our next wreath cookie, I have this shape here. Again, this is a plaque that I guess just a general shape that I'd like to use. It's interesting, a little bit more interesting than just a normal circle. And I use it in so many sets. And you can put anything on it really. But I feel it works great for this. So here I'm using my outline consistency. And again, do what feels comfortable. Sometimes, going left to right is easier for me. So you'll see when I get to the bottom of the cookie that I'm going, I skip a few bumps and I go left to right. Sometimes I go right to left just to see, depends, where I'm looking at the cookie, where it is for me. Sometimes when I'm filming, it's a little bit harder because I don't have it exactly where I want it to. And I stay close to the cookie. When I'm outlining my cookie, the curves are so small that I just stay really close to my cookie. And even if I'm almost dragging my icing, which you really never do with royal icing, that's totally okay because I tried to cover it a little bit with my flood. As you'll see, I kind of get right in there. And then, I'll take my scribe maybe later and just pull it over the edge of the icing. But with this cookie, I tend to not lift my bag up too much because those curves are really small. And once you've flooded your cookie, you want to set it aside, let it dry. All right, now we're gonna do the base of our wreath. So I have my brown outline consistency here, and I'm just going to make a circle. And so I touch down and I'm just lifting my bag up and just holding it in the air, and I'm just going along. So sometimes you have to guide your outline. So if you're pulling your icing string really tight, you have to, go a little bit outside or further than your circle to get it to land where you want it to land. If you are pushing a little bit more pressure, so your string is kind of going almost straight down to the cookie, then you can sort of guide it a little better. So it depends like how much pressure and how tight you're holding that string of icing. Sometimes you have to go way past where you actually want the icing to land. So just get a feel for it. You can do this, practice a few times on a paper towel, and then you can go ahead and do it on your cookie. I'm just going to keep layering until I have a nice, thick, branchy looking circle here. And when you're done, you can touch down. If you want to add more, you can go ahead and give a few more branches there. And again, I'm going to go in with my green icing, my light green icing. This is my outline consistency, and I'm doing the pressure and pull kind of motion again. So I keep my bag in one spot, squeeze the bag, get those little bubble of icing out, and then I drag the bag down. And that'll give me a little tip. Before you start this section, you want to make sure that your brown icing has dried a little bit. It's very thick icing, so it doesn't take too long to dry. Enough so that when you're piping this green stuff, you won't be able to move the brown icing. It'll stay in its place. And it's hard to pipe on top of that brown icing because you're going from a flat surface to a kind of bumpy, raised surface. And even for me, I just kind of go with it. I just try to pipe and just keep going on top. It doesn't always look the best, but then you can add those little details at the end or add a few extra leaves here and there, and it just comes together. So here I'm just adding some lines in the inside of the wreath. And I'm just going to alternate and do, a few leaves here and then a few of these sort of branches here. And you can see I'm piping on the cookie and then on the branch. So it's not the smoothest, perfect looking lines. But I'm just getting my base to see where I'm going to go with this, and then I'll come back after and then pipe on top just to give it more depth and coverage. And sometimes your thick icing doesn't stick well to the cookie, and that's okay. You can just wipe off your tip if it is stuck to your tip. Just give it a little swipe, get rid of that icing and start fresh. A lot of times with thick icing, it doesn't stick well because it's kind of dry, really, if you think about it. There's less water in it, so it's kind of dry and it doesn't stick well to dry icing, or if your flood has dried already or you're piping on top of thicker icing. Sometimes you got to really push out that icing and touch it down well to something like the other icing so that it sticks to the cookie. If your icing is not sticking at all, if you're having a lot of trouble with these lines and not sticking well, then it usually means that it's just a little bit too dry. So if you are having a really hard time outlining, I actually had this with some of my Christmas cookies I was working on. I made my outline a little bit too thick, and it just kept breaking on me. It wouldn't stick to the cookie. It stuck for the first few seconds, and as I continued piping my line, I was just ending up pulling my whole piping line, to another, it would just come off. And so I actually had to add a few drops of water to it, remix it together just with a spoon, stirred it in, and it makes such a difference. When icing is giving you trouble and it's not giving you the result, it's usually the consistency. If your flood is just way too loose and you're flooding areas that are smaller and you can't control it because it's just coming out so fast, usually it's too thin, so add a little powdered sugar. For these details too, if they're not coming out sharp enough, if sometimes your stiff icing isn't stiff enough, your outline is not thick enough, then that's when you want to add a little powdered sugar to it. Give it a stir, see if it looks a bit thicker. If not, you might have to add a little bit more. Sometimes it looks really thick when you add powdered sugar right away. You start stirring in, you're like, oh my gosh, I added too much powdered sugar. And then as you stir and stir and stir, you see that it's actually absorbed it all, and it's not quite as thick as you thought it would be. So sometimes I usually add some powdered sugar, stir it up, see how it is. I might add a little bit more after. And again, you want to make it stiff, but not too stiff where it's dry and it's not sticking to your cookie. For the ones that you're pressure piping, if you make those too stiff too, then it's really hard to get a nice smooth kind of leaf out of it. And so once I've done, I'm just going to do this one side here. And so I've built up my leaves, so I like them now. And I'm going to add the last little detail. So this is my outline red. And again, in groups of 3 here, I'm going to add the holly and then a couple one-offs just to give it a little more detail. Sometimes it's too much if you have groups of 3 everywhere. So I like to add a little dot here and there. Okay, on to our last cookie. So this here is going to be our holly cookie, and I'm going to outline. So every time I am, you can see my icing broke there. So again, I just wipe the tip off, and I'm going to go, so I'm focusing from one corner to the other. So I'm touching down, securing my icing, lifting up my bag, and slowly as I get to that next corner, I lower my piping bag to that corner so I can touch down. So I'm focusing from point A to point B where I'm going to get, and in between will fix itself because I'm pulling the icing to make it nice and straight. Once my outline has dried, I can go in and flood. Notice my left finger against my piping bag there. I kind of pipe two-handed even when I'm flooding, especially around these edges because I want my hand nice and steady. And that finger really helps me keep a steady bag. So my right hand is doing all the pressure, squeezing the bag. And that left finger is sort of guiding my hand to make it nice and steady. Especially when you're putting pressure on the bag, it's really hard to keep a steady hand. So this really, really helps. And if my flood is really loose, see there's a few gaps there. I do that on purpose sometimes. Just because if I have a really loose flood, it ends up being too much on my cookie and it flows a little bit too much over the edge. So I usually leave a few gaps and then just fill it in with my scribe. And here we're going to do the same technique as the stocking. So I've got my icing nice and dry. And then I'm going to put some flood icing and use the paintbrush, and I'm just dabbing straight down. And again, if your flood is really loose and as you're dabbing, or you put too much flood, let's say, and it, you're dabbing, but it kind of melts down and it's not keeping that texture, then, keep going at it, because the more you work it, the more it'll sort of dry out. And if it's still really wet and it's not keeping it, you can put it aside for, or just stop for like 30 seconds, 20 seconds, depending how wet it is, and then come back with the brush just as it's starting to dry, and that'll give you more texture. It's hard to see the detail in the video, but it looks amazing. To me, it just gives it a little bit of detail, gives it that snowy look, that wintry look that we're going for. So here you can scrape in to the cookie a rough outline if you want, or you can freehand. I've practiced a few times on paper towel, but I'm just kind of going rough edge of the holly here, and one of the leaves is going off the side, which is fine. I like kind of mixing it up sometimes that it's not all centered. And after I outline it, I'm going to go in and flood. I like to let my outlines dry. I feel like it holds the flood in. It holds the shape much better. Sometimes when I tend to flood right after I outline, my flood pushes the outline into like outward, and so it doesn't look as good, as sharp and clean. I find when the outline is dry, it stays in its place much better and it doesn't get pushed around by the flood. And then once that's done, we're going to grab our red outline consistency, and I'm going to make the 3 holly dots. And I have a little peek because it is thicker icing, and so I go in with my scribe and I just wiggle. And I'm just trying to get rid of that little peak, but this is a nice puffy icing because it's my outline icing. And that's our last cookie, the holly cookie. Well, I hope you enjoyed the Winter Wonderland Christmas tutorial. Thank you so much for watching, as always, and thank you so much for supporting my channel. Stay tuned for more Christmas tutorials. Happy baking and decorating!